Welcome to all you curious minds out there. Thank you for tuning in to a brand new episode of Flying Chariots The Rise. Tonight we have the privilege of having Steve Causey as our guest, author of the book The LBL Massacre. Stay with us as we unlock the tragic and chilling story of a brutal incident that allegedly took place in the land between the lakes. Picture this, guys. A family innocently exploring the peaceful countryside suddenly find themselves the victims of an unknown assailant. The aftermath is terrifying. Disfigured corpses and signs of an attack so strange that it makes your blood run cold. As witness reports starts to pile up, a mysterious figure emerges, the infamous Dogman. In tonight's episode, Steve Causey takes us on a voyage through the pages of his book, revealing the painstaking research and harrowing details behind the LBL Massacre. What really happened on that fateful day? Is the Dogman the herald of tragedy, or is there more to this disturbing story? Let's find out, guys. My guest today, Steve Causey, the author of the book LBL Massacre. Welcome, Steve.
Hey.
Steve, I know self-introductions can be a little bit weird sometimes, but if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself and the things you do.
Well, I am a resident of Dover, Tennessee, which is near the land between the lakes where this story in my book occurred in the year 1982. And when I first heard the story, I was skeptical of it. I was an engineer my entire career. I'm retired now, but I worked for CNN for many years. But after hearing and interviewing a couple of eyewitnesses, I now believe the story that I heard was probably very true. And I have to credit a couple of people I've met over the last year and a half. And these are credible witnesses. One of them is a retired law enforcement officer. And he told me his story about an experience he had in this area, the land between the lakes. And he's a very credible witness. And there are several others I've interviewed that have seen things that should not exist in this particular area of the land between the lakes. And the land between the lakes, to give you a little background about it, is the largest inland peninsula in the United States. It's bordered by Kentucky Lake on one side and by Barkley Lake on the other side. And a little background, my father fought in World War II. I began the book with that. And he was returning from Germany. He had been wounded in the hand with a German rifle grenade, and he was escorting two blind soldiers that had lost their sight during the war back to their states. And then he would get leave to allow his hand to heal up. And that's the way I began this book. And he was literally, when he came back, the area had changed so much. They had flooded the rivers in order to make this area, and he did not even recognize the place that he got off to go back to his home. So he had to ask somebody on the bus literally where he got off. Fortunately, there was a young lady there that knew where he got off and where his mother had moved to since he'd been overseas, and he hadn't been back to this area since 1939. He had been maneuvering and joined the army earlier in, I believe it was August of 1939, and had been maneuvering, and then the wars broke out. Of course, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and he immediately became involved. But he spent his time in the European battlefield in North Africa and Germany. And after North Africa, he trained troops for what would be the D-Day invasion. But he did not even recognize his area when he came back. That's how much this area had changed. He went from living close to a river that was maybe 1 kilometer wide to a lake that was over 5 kilometers wide. And you can see how that would confuse somebody coming back trying to make their way back home.
There's a few people out there, and I'm one of them, that have never heard of the LBL Massacre. So please, if you want, fill us in into the story and how you came across.
Sure. I first heard the story back in 1998. And this is my book. It's called The LBL Massacre. And the story I heard was that there was a family killed in the Upper Peninsula. Now, the Upper Peninsula would be in the Kentucky area. This area is so large it encompasses part of Kentucky as well as the state of Tennessee. And as the story goes, there was a family that was killed that had been camping up in the Upper Peninsula. Now, this family was not simply killed, they were literally massacred. The father's arms had been pulled off, he had been bitten, he had been severely clawed. There was blood all over the outside of the camper, and there was blood all inside the camper. And there seemed to be a human like hand mark inside of the camper that scraped down where with blood, but it seemed to be human like, but at the same time, it had clawed the inside of the camper. So here we have some very unusual marks inside this camper that don't appear to be made by any known animal. It is said there were 6 coroners on the site of this grisly scene. One of these coroners was a regional coroner from Memphis, Tennessee, which is about 200 miles away from this area. Now, it's very unusual to have 6 coroners on the site of any kind of murder or anything. I later learned by a retired law enforcement officer if they were going to call in a regional coroner, he would be from Memphis, Tennessee, because Memphis, Tennessee covered the southern Kentucky area as well as the western Tennessee area. So that kind of corroborates my story to some extent because not your average person would know that a coroner would come all the way from Memphis, Tennessee, about 200 miles away to this scene. The father was found outside the camper, and the mother and daughter were found or excuse me, the mother and the son were found. The son was found, as I heard it, just outside the camper door, apparently trying to get back in. The mother was found inside the camper, and she had been literally torn to shreds. After a little bit of investigation, the deputies on the scene come to the conclusion there was yet another family member. They had observed the 3 family members that were slaughtered there at the camper, but they found dresses that would only fit a young girl about 9 or 10 years old. So the people on the scene, which at this time, the deputies, I think, were the first to arrive, but ambulances and rescue squad. I don't know whether you have rescue squads in Germany, but we have volunteer units that go out and look for people. And they were observing all these little girl clothes that were in the back bedroom. So they assumed that there was a young girl that was with them. So they started a search. They started spreading out with law enforcement. And one of these deputies had only gone, the story I heard was about 100 yards or a little bit less, which would be about an American football field in length, until the 2 deputies that were accompanying them, excuse me, one of them felt blood dripping on his hat. And he didn't know where it was coming from, so he looked up and he saw this little girl about 30 feet in the air, and she had been, as I was told the story, eaten on. Some people say she was disemboweled, but she had obviously been slaughtered, and something had been eating on her and taking chunks out of her. It was probably, as I heard the story, around 3 a.m. when federal authorities moved in. These weren't local authorities, these were federal authorities. And they told everybody not to speak of what they had seen. Do not talk about this incident. And through some other witnesses that were accounted to me, the military came in, and there were military units on the scene. There were military armament, just military equipment. It's not certain exactly which organization this was. We don't know whether it was the 101st Airborne, which is very close to that area. They have a base there. Or we don't know whether it was some other military unit. That was uncertain, because it was probably some special forces unit, because the gentleman that talked to me said they didn't know the military because there weren't many markings on these Jeeps and these trucks that they brought in. Some of the law enforcement officers that had been told to leave, they were told to close the park and put patrols on the perimeter, which they did. And I can confirm that the park closed during this period of time, because I ran a bait shop at the lower entrance to the land between the lakes. And I had several of my customers come back and tell me, or ask me, stop in at my bait shop and say, ask if I knew why the park had closed. They were carrying their boats, and I said, no, I have no idea why it's closed. It was more than one, so I'm sure the park was closed. And of course, this was in 1982. I can't remember the exact date, because this was 40 some odd years ago, but I do remember it was in the spring. I believe it was in the month of April early, which is pretty much what most of the people who have recounted the story say. It was around approximately April 9th or April 7th, 1982. So these officers on the perimeter of the park started hearing automatic gunfire. It was in the morning sometime, several automatic weapons going off. And they still kept the park closed, as they were told. They were turning people around that were attempting to enter the park. Now, keep in mind, this is a very large park. They had to close it on the Tennessee end, which is approximately 30 to 35 miles south, and then they had to close it on the upper end. And any roads leading into the park, they had to close. Some of the Department of Natural Resources, this is the story I heard it, as I heard it, officers were allowed back in, only a few. But I think it leaked out a little bit. I'm not certain if my story came indirectly from law enforcement. I would assume it had to have. But as they were allowed back in, a couple of them were taken over to help identify a creature that had been killed. They were loading this creature onto the back of what's known as a 2.5 military truck. It's a 2.5 ton truck, and I have a picture of it in my book as well. And this truck is approximately 12 foot long. The witnesses say the creature took up the better portion of this truck. Now, I assume they were pulling it because they said they witnessed 8 soldiers loading this thing onto the truck, which means it was a massive creature. It was very heavy. I assume that its arms were spread out like this, and it was probably more in the area of 9 feet is what I'm assuming. I'm assuming they're assuming the arms took up the uh, upper portion where it bordered to the back of the truck there, but I don't know that. But it was a very large creature. The exact size is unknown. It was they had brought these DNR officers back on the scene to help try to identify what this creature might be. It was had a very foul odor. They literally had to cover their mouths and noses with it because it was so foul. And it had the head of a dog, a very large dog, about 2 or 3 times the size of a normal dog. It had clawed hands. It had clawed feet. And the military had tracked this creature to a dugout cave and where they had engaged it with automatic weapons. A large portion of the creature's upper body was blown out because they had hit it with so many rounds. But the witnesses on the scene said several of the deputies, several of the law enforcement, and everything when they first came to the scene of the camper were throwing up. The foul odor that this thing had left in the camper was so foul that they had literally thrown up, which is unusual for law enforcement and medical people. I once was an EMT myself. You have some pretty horrific car crashes in the United States. Some of them which are pretty bad, and I have been to a couple of them myself, which were pretty bad. And I've never seen any law enforcement throw up, but it could be that the odor that this creature had left in the camper was strong enough to where it just literally made a lot of people on site sick. And the odor was described as the smell of death. So it was not a pleasant odor.
That's a crazy, crazy story. Um, so do you have more details about the investigation that took place?
These are the only known details that I was told in the story. This story happened over 40 years ago. It's surprising that the details have remained very close in all the other stories and the research I've done in order to make this book. I did as much research trying to learn as many details as I could. Now, there are variations in small details about the story. Some people say that it was on a different date, a slightly different date. Some people say that it was a particular kind of camper. My understanding was that it was not a self-propelled camper. It was a towed camper, but I'm not 100% sure. They had pulled it in with a vehicle. There is one gentleman that claimed to have been there through the massacre. I'm not saying that I doubt him. I listened to every story, and his story is circulated online. And he claimed to have been there, and he escaped by crawling under the vehicle. And this was a self-powered camper and hiding under the drive shaft as the creature was attacking. Uh, I give everybody credibility. I don't know whether his story is true or whether his story is related to another story which may have occurred there as well. There may have been more than one attack. I have several sub stories in my book that validate this story leading up to it. Several eyewitness accounts of encounters with these creatures before and after the actual massacre that was assumed to have occurred in 1982. One of them includes a retired law enforcement officer, which I'm very good friends with. He has his own book out now, and I'm going to show you that book here in just a minute, because on the front cover of this book, he is one of the few people that was surrounded and attacked by these creatures that actually survived. He was armed. He was a deputy sheriff in another county close to to the land between the lakes, and he and his partner, which also was a deputy sheriff, were able to fire off some rounds and run these creatures off, or at least delay them until they jumped into their truck and took off. And the book I'm going to show you is written by Mr. Martin Groves, who I've interviewed personally, a very trustworthy, honest, and credible retired law enforcement officer. And he had an artist, a very good artist, render the front cover of his book so that you can get his eyewitness account of what these creatures look like. And this is the creature that surrounded him, one of several, and attacked him. He was, as I said, he was able to get off a few rounds and run this creature off, scare it long enough to where they could jump in their truck. He was in the land between the lakes area. He was turkey hunting. One thing he told me he did not put in his book is he said this creature almost communicated to him in a telepathic way, telling him that I'm going to kill you and there's nothing you can do about it. But he felt like he was literally in shock seeing this creature because, I mean, literally, if you see something like this that should not exist, naturally it's going to scare you. As a matter of fact, his deputy partner had a stroke during this incident, and he was never able to work again as a deputy. And it scared him so bad. But they fired off his friend fired off a double barrel 10 gauge shotgun at these things. And Martin pulled his pistol and shot several rounds at him. That scared him and ran him off for long enough to jump on the back of the truck, and they literally were chased out by these creatures. It's credible eyewitnesses from a retired law enforcement officer like this that leads me to believe that the story I originally heard was true. And do I know these creatures exist? No, I have not seen one, but I have talked to many credible eyewitnesses that say that these creatures do exist. They have seen them. Now, a lot of people say that, well, was this creature actually some kind of a DNA experiment by the military, which was developed by the military? There's one major flaw in that theory. Now, whether and I'm not one for conspiracy theories. If I hear a story that I think is true, I will tell it. But in the 1600s, when French settlers were first moving into this area, even before it became the United States, the Shawnee Indians had given a warning to the French settlers, do not go into these areas. And they told them the particular areas, which were mainly in Kentucky. They said, do not go into these areas. And these trappers ignored it. Not all of them, but some of them ignored it because they thought, well, maybe there's really a great trapping area in here where we're going to get a lot of beaver pelts and everything. They were never heard from again. Some of them that went in, some of them I have heard that they found their mutilated bodies. And the Shawnee Indians, through French translation, this was translated into Loup-garou, which translates into wolf man. So these creatures have been around a long time. They are in this area. It's not, I believe these creatures having the senses of wolves, obviously they do, because there's several eyewitness accounts of these creatures sniffing the air, smelling the air like a dog would or a wolf would. I believe these creatures are in there. I don't think they attack very often, but I think their senses are strong enough. A wolf has 100 times the smelling ability of a human being. So these creatures are going to be around, and you're not going to ever see them. They're masters of disguise. They blend with the wood, just like the purported Bigfoot sighting that you have. Bigfoot is rarely seen. because he knows you're there long before you know he is there. And I believe this is why there are sightings of these creatures. There's very little video evidence of them, but it does exist. There's some captures of these creatures, but they're usually, much like Bigfoot, they're blurry images or images taken by somebody that was literally shaking with their camera.
In Europe, we would call it the werewolf, but it's somewhat different from the wolfman, I guess, but or the dogman. Um, but the werewolf also is an experiment according to folklore. So it's it could be. And I heard the story of a guy, and I think it's on Linda Moulton House channel. I heard it on Linda Moulton House YouTube channel, and she told the story of a guy who drove on the road and he heard the sound. His windows were open, passenger side window was open, and he heard the sound, and suddenly, yeah, a dogman appeared alongside his car, and it ran alongside his car and stuck his head into the window and tried to grab him. And then, while driving, he shot the creature, and it fell down and was on the floor. And a few miles after that, he changed his mind and he stopped and he turned around to see if this thing was dead or still there. And he drove by and he saw two or three guys standing there and a police car and an unmarked car. And he stopped and said and told them what happened. And these guys appeared to be angry, angry about what he did. So that was his impression. He said, "Man, these guys are somewhat angry about me. I don't know what happened." But that led him to believe that this creature, and he heard stories of course, after that, he heard stories that these creatures are, like you said, could be an experiment by the military or by the government. So I'm not sure what to think about the dogman. And I I first heard about the dogman a few months ago, to be honest, from a guy who was doing Bigfoot research, and he told me about the dogman and told me how he has this footprint that he found in the woods. And I thought, could this be real? We're talking about a werewolf-like thing. So it's it's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah, trying to wrap my mind around, but um, it seems
It
like
is hard to wrap your mind around something like this because it's a creature that should not exist and apparently does. Once I said once I had said earlier, I there are too many credible witnesses that I have interviewed, and I have also seen Linda's story. Very good. Seems like a very credible gentleman that tells about this incident inside his truck. Now, whether there has been manipulation with the DNA with these creatures, I'm not. I can't say. I don't have any. Other than the credible, apparently credible or seemingly credible witnesses, such as what Linda had interviewed with this gentleman. I think he's telling the truth. You can more or less look at a person, and when they recount their story, you can kind of tell whether this is made up or not by, in my opinion, by the way they talk to you. And so I believe this gentleman. I believe he had an encounter with it. Whether this is a manipulated DNA creature, I think that's possible. I mean, if you sit and consider this would, and one thing I put in my book is if they are uh, DNA manipulated, you would not want these creatures to be thrown on your position in a military situation. I mean, the sheer awe and shock factor would be enough to have several soldiers killed, and not let alone trying to eliminate the threat. Uh, there is DNA evidence of Bigfoot, and I list this in my book a couple of times. There have actually been what is called environmental DNA samples taken. One of them was taken up at an island that's off Alaska in the northern the Alaskan territory. And they had actually put out a screw trap or a nail trap and set it in front of this cabin. And I credit this to Monster Quest in my book. I have reference to their story. And they thought it was a bear that was breaking into this remote cabin. The only way this area could be accessed is by plane or boat. It doesn't have any bridges or anything to it. It's literally an island, but a lot of people like to bear hunt there. But they initially thought this was a bear that was breaking into their cabin. But there were differences in it. The bears usually tear into a refrigerator with their claws because there are certain materials inside of a refrigerator that attract a bear. The insulation in it has a smell that they perceive as food. And but that was not done. Things were just tossed around in here. I mean, literally picked up and tossed around. So they set one of these traps, and something stepped on it, and they were able to get DNA samples from it. It came back as 99.8% human with 2 ape markers in it. Now it is not possible to have 98% human DNA. It's either 100% DNA or it's something else. It's not possible even with contamination to get something that has a percentage of human DNA and a percentage of ape. Now you can contaminate a DNA sample and it just comes out human. But this DNA was sequenced several times in order to pull out the markers, but 2 of them were ape markers. And not only that, there's environmental DNA, which has been gathered in the northwest of the United States, which comes back with the same readings. Basically 99% human, 99.8, excuse me, but 8 markers. So I don't think it's a stretch to assume that we have DNA evidence of Bigfoot, that there might not be other creatures such as dogmen, which are similar to humans, but obviously dog-like. Now, the other interesting thing about this, there have been witnesses, one of them I consider a credible witness, that recorded the speed of this creature on all fours. They stand up, and a lot of times they attack on 2 feet, but they run very fast like a dog on 4 feet. One gentleman clocked this with the equipment he had available, clocked one of these creatures at 47 miles an hour. Now, obviously, what is that, about 56 kilometers per hour in that range, roughly. You're not going to escape a creature that runs that fast if he decides to prey on you.
Wow. Did you ever talk to a military witness or law enforcement witness that have actually been there?
No, I have not. I cannot, and I'm not going to tell a fib by saying I did. My story was strictly secondhand, but the witnesses I have interviewed, some of them are law enforcement and ex-law enforcement officers, should I say. Matter of fact, all of them were ex-law enforcement officers. They lend credibility to this, and as I said, Martin Groves is one who I consider a very, very credible witness. And the fact that he saw one of these creatures up close, it is a big plus. As a matter of fact, he goes into different areas in the United States and talks at the different conferences they have, such as Bigfoot or Dogman. But as far as military, no, I cannot say that I have.
Besides these stories that we just heard, what makes us so sure that these injuries on these killed people are not inflicted by a bear or, let's say, a mountain lion or something like that?
That is a very good point. And one of the things that the coroners noticed on these bodies was, and as a matter of fact, one of the deputies, as I had heard the story, had asked one of the coroners, is this the work of a bear or is this the work of a wolf? And this coroner had just shaken his head and didn't say anything else. But one of the coroners had noticed in one of the father's arm there was a dark fur. This fur was later analyzed, and it came back an unknown hominid. The closest match they could find was wolf. The second thing is the coroners. The reason there were so many of them on the scene is the father had claw marks, and the mother was mutilated worse than the father, is what I'd heard. But the father had claw marks on the back of his back, which were an opposing thumb. Bears do not have opposing thumbs. They're more a rounded claw print like this. Wolves do not have opposing thumbs. These were a hand with opposing thumb that had claws extending out of it, and it raked the back of the father's back down. There is no other creature other than a human with maybe some kind of claw device or something on that would do this, but there is certainly no human that would have the strength to bite and rip the arms off of a person. And not only that, I forgot to mention, the door was locked from the inside, they determined on this camper. It had been pulled open and was only hanging on one hinge. So this creature had literally ripped one hinge off to get in at the mother and the daughter. So there are several factors from the scene, as I heard it, that indicated no, this was not any kind of known animal, such as a bear or a wolf.
If that would have been a human with something like a claw device, as you named it, those bodies were scattered around in a I think in a wider distance. You would have found them in a wider distance and not all together. But what made me curious is the body of the little girl. You told me that it was found up in the trees, and that's somewhat strange. I think it's strange for a human, and it's strange for a dog or a wolf to pull his prey up in the trees. That's strange. This is why
Yeah.
I thought about, I don't know if mountain lions do something like that, or big cats. I think big cats sometimes do that, but I'm not familiar with their behavior. So this is why I thought about some kind of a mountain lion or something, or a big cat.
Yes, cheetahs are known to in Africa are known to carry their and I mentioned this in my book. It's kind of like a cheetah dragging its prey up in the tree so it can be peacefully fed on. Uh, a mountain lion, yes, but a mountain lion would not explain the claw marks that were found on the bodies. A mountain lion is a very distinguishable mark, and it doesn't have an opposing thumb,
Hmm.
which is really, and a mountain lion would not be able to open a camper and rip the door off to where it was hanging on one hinge. Uh, but cheetahs do. I think leopards do. There are black panthers, which is a variation. Now, wildlife management authorities don't acknowledge them being in this area, but I actually saw one when I was a child. Uh, I used to live in the land between the lakes before this area was cleared out. They in 1963, they moved all the residents out. My father had just retired from the Army in 1960. He had fought in Germany and Korea. And so we had lived there about 2 years, and we had to move to a small town close to here named Clarksville, Tennessee, because they literally moved everybody out and made this a wildlife area. Uh, I have been told by a credible witness that would know, and I'm not going to mention his name, but the original reason they cleared the residents out of this area was they were going to build a nuclear breeder reactor in this area, which would require the rivers for cooling, a large one. But that for some reason that plan was dismissed, and this became a recreational area. Whether that is true, I don't know for certain. I've just been told by somebody that I believe that would have had direct knowledge of the fact that this might have that is the original reason they by what's called eminent domain took this area, and so the strange thing about this is there is hunting there. I mean, it's a beautiful area. It's probably one of the most beautiful wild areas, if not the most beautiful wild area in the United States. There is hunting in there. This is the way we get these witness stories, is such as Martin Grove, who was turkey hunting in there when this thing attacked him, or these things attacked him. And he was very lucky to escape. He's probably one of the few witnesses to escape an attack by these things. These things, if they decide to prey on you, they don't leave witnesses. They leave bodies. They leave bodies that are eaten on. Now, another story in my book, which is also in Martin Grove's book, because he was connected to this story because he had actually met this gentleman the day before that was killed by this creature. Is this gentleman was bow hunting for turkey. And I know that sounds strange, but some people do bow hunt for turkey. And his body was found about 150 to 200 yards from his tent, which had claw marks in it that had been ripped open, and his body was partially consumed. And Martin had met this gentleman the day before he had his experience, and or at least he's certain of it because he identified the man's truck because he had gone back to report this to the authorities down there. So yes, there are black panthers there, but black panthers cannot drag a 200-pound man 200 yards. They will more or less eat him on sight, and they may drag him a few yards if he's not too heavy. If it's small, to make your point of the young girl, which probably didn't weigh. She's 10 years old. She probably weighed 40 or 50 pounds, maybe 60 pounds, depending on her stature. But it would be a struggle for them to even drag a creature up 30 feet into the air like this. These dogmen are known to have claws that are anywhere from 2 to 3 inches long. So it's very easy for them, particularly since they run like dogs, they kind of behave like dogs, to easily climb a tree because of the fact of their claws. Now, an ordinary dog cannot climb a tree because its claws are not long enough to grip around a tree. And if you've ever seen a dog try to climb up a tree, it'll just sit and pull bark down like this. This thing, as large as they are described to be, is able to grip a tree and easily climb up it like a pole. So, and it probably had this young girl in its mouth. Now, as I said, I was not there in 1982. I cannot attest for the exact credibility of this story, but this story has been told more than once, and there are other credible eyewitnesses. One of the credible eyewitnesses is a young lady in Grand Rivers, Kentucky. Now, keep in mind, this was 1982. There were no cell phones. There were only landlines. The couple that discovered the site went into Grand Rivers, which is only about 3 to 4 miles from where it's a very small town now, and in 1982 it was probably even smaller. And stopped at a convenience store there and called, or I stopped at a telephone, a pay telephone. I'm not sure if it was at the convenience store, but it was around that area. and called the deputies in. They refused to go back in to the land between the lakes, and they rented a motel. They would not go back in, but they gave directions for these deputies to this camp area. And they were literally shaken to the core. Now, the young lady had later talked to these two deputies, which this young lady is very credible. She did her own book, and her name was Jan Thompson. And from I have never met her, but from everything I've read in her book and everything, it seems to match up with the story I had heard. Now, but my understanding is that either her grandfather or father was sheriff of this area at that time. And she describes these deputies stopping into the store, and they are literally, one of them's throwing up, and they're both literally, she could tell something has happened to them. These were the deputies that were on the scene of this camper, and they slowly but surely begin to tell her what they had seen. And this young lady is also a credible witness. She is deceased now, but she has written a book. Her name is Jan Thompson.
Back to the original story. You told us that these bodies were mutilated, of course, and the father had his arms ripped out, so crazy injuries. But do we really know how they died? I mean, did they die from the blood loss, or was there a bite wound to the neck or something like that?
There were bite wounds all over these victims. I forgot to mention that. I apologize. There were deep bite wounds on these victims. And some of them, I'm sure, were in shock before they died. But the overwhelming cause of the death was blood loss.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, blood loss would have been it. I'm sure some of them were in shock before this happened. The mother, as related to me, now, do I know this for a fact? No, I don't. There is supposedly, and I have been told by a credible retired law enforcement officer, there is a record of this family's death in one of the Kentuckies in Kentucky. It's called Lyon County, Kentucky, where this event took place. There is a record, a written record of this. But I think more than one retired law enforcement officer may have tried to access this, or somebody tried to access this, and they say if you attempt to access this record, you'll be met with a large amount of condemnation and will not be allowed to look at the records for obvious reasons. And I'm sure that would give the exact cause of what killed these people. But overwhelmingly, from the amount of blood that was in the camper, on the camper, and around the camper, I'm sure with claws 2 inches to 3 inches long, I'm sure they hit arteries. I used to be an EMT myself with the rescue squad back years ago as a volunteer. I'm sure they hit arteries. These would bleed out a person within minutes. And so, not to mention the sheer shock factor of having to deal with something like this that should not exist.
Do you think that this creature back then killed, let's say, purposeful or goal oriented? So it knew that they were there and went there in for the kill, or what do you think?
I believe that this creature, from what I had heard, uh, and from what research I've done, I can't go into the mind of this creature, but this was one of the first campers that was on the scene. It was fairly early, and I think they had wanted to get in and get a premium spot. The other thing about this campsite that I'd like to mention is, and I was up there just recently, this campsite, and I have pictures of it, had paved roads. It would be asphalt roads, what we call asphalt roads, which is not the premium pavement that you'll see on like an interstate, but yet a covered road. Some people also call these crusher run roads, but there's another term for them, and it kind of slips my mind at this time. There are evidences of where a bulldozer just came along and scraped all this out, tore all the buildings down. There were restrooms there, obviously. You can see the foundations, concrete foundations where these were. This campsite was literally erased. You would think if there was some reason for monetary or whatever that they would simply close this camp area, put locks on it, leave the bathrooms there and everything. This campsite was erased. It was simply a bulldozer pushed it off. But there is evidence there. You can see where it was. Now, some people have speculated, this is strictly speculation, that since they were probably the first or second person on this campsite scene and everything, this creature got mad at him because he thought this was his territory. And I have a theory also, and it kind of correlates with some of my other researchers that are looking into this, one of them being Martin Groves, as I had mentioned earlier, that these creatures may not bother you if you don't put up a tent or put up some kind of structure. If they think they're trying to move into your territory, excuse me, then they see that as a threat. I think that's probably a valid reason why this creature may have attacked them. It may have said, no, this is not yours, this is mine. Because during the winter periods of the month, there would be nobody there. Nobody would be in this area during the winter. But if you're one of the first or two campers that comes out there and literally pulls a camper in and starts chopping firewood and creating a camping situation, as all of us know that have been camping, then I think this creature may have seen that as a threat to his environment. That is my personal theory. Obviously, I can't go into the mind of this creature.
Of course. But to be more specific, maybe, do you think it's possible? Of course, we don't know. We can only speculate. Do you think that these beings could be, let's call it, remote controlled, or are they instinct driven? Or what do you think? How intelligent could they be?
I believe they are very intelligent because Martin Grove, as I indicated in his book and everything, he did not put this in his book, and I don't think he minds me telling this, but when I interviewed him, he said this creature was almost able to communicate with him telepathically, telling him that, I'm basically here to kill you and there's nothing you can do. But depending on when these creatures arrived, obviously some form of this creature has been here for many years. I have to go back to the account, and this is pretty well documented with some of the French settlers indicating that these creatures were there in the 1600s. I think they're very intelligent, but the thing that makes them stand out is if you take a wolf that has 100 times the ability to smell that a human does, this creature is going to know you're around before you ever know it's around. I think it's intelligent enough, like Bigfoot is, to where if it doesn't want to be seen, it's not going to be seen. And I'm gonna say that the majority of people that go in to the land between the lakes will never see one of these creatures, never have a problem with one of these creatures. My theory is, and I'll tell you about an incident that occurred last year, which is the latest known incident I know in this area. But Martin Groves had told me about this incident. But if these creatures sense that you're trying to move into their area and pitch a tent, put some kind of structure or something up, and they've got young ones there, there's always the possibility they're trying to protect these young ones, just like any uh, other creature would. Now, there is evidence there is a breeding population. I go into this in my book down there because of some eyewitness accounts. One of these was a gentleman that was going through the land between the lakes on the main road through there, which is called the Trace. And he observed a mother with the head of a wolf walking upright with 3 or 4 pups behind it. Of these creatures walked in front of his vehicle. He put his brakes on, and it turned and looked at him, and it had a wolf-like head. But there were 3 little creatures following behind this, obviously her offspring. He described this creature as being about 6 foot tall, not as big as the male creature, but obviously a female because it had its pups behind it, and they were literally making dog-like noises, only deeper. You could tell their diaphragm was a little bigger from an ordinary dog. And so there is credible evidence there is a breeding population of these creatures in there. And to answer your question, my theory, and this is just my theory, is that these animals are territorial. And, as you know, wolves live in dens. They have areas they consider their territory. If another wolf from another pack goes into this territory, they can tell by the scent where they have scented these trees and different things. And if they proceed on into this territory, sometimes they are literally killed or attacked by the pack. So I think there is this kind of behavior with these creatures. They consider certain areas their territory. And if you move in and attempt to set up some kind of permanent camp or tent or something like that, I think you have a chance of possibly being harassed or attacked by these creatures. There's not always someone killed with these things. If you persist in staying there, as the deer hunter did, or excuse me, the turkey hunter that I described in Martin's book did for like maybe 2 or 3 nights. My theory is these creatures are going to think that you're going to remain there for some time, and they may attack.
Crazy. So back to the original story. What was the outcome? What kind of story did the officials present to the public? I mean, there were relatives and friends who have lost
Nothing.
someone.
This story was covered up completely because park officials, for obvious reason, because there is a tourism into this area and hunting and campers. The story was covered up on purpose, so I've heard. If the story is true, and as I said, I have talked to many eyewitnesses that I believe are credible. I do not know for a fact the story is true, but it was covered up. It was never made public. It was scraped under the rug. These campsites were destroyed, basically bulldozed off of the map, and nothing was done. Same with Martin's story. Martin is a very credible Martin Groves, as I showed you his book, who is one of the witnesses I have interviewed. His story was covered up. This was later publicized as a mangy bear attack. Was the way that the murder of this bow hunter, the turkey hunter, was an unknown animal, probably a mangy bear, which there haven't been bear in the land between the lakes for well over 100 years. Now, in order for bear to get in there, they would have to go across several populated areas to get in there. Now, there is a possibility there are a few bears in there. But bears do not leave. They have a very distinctive print that they leave. And I'm going to be working on a second edition of my book. I don't know when it'll come out. It may be later next year. But I have since interviewed several people. One of the people that I interviewed has been a trapper since he was 10 years old. His father taught him how to trap. He has trapped and hunted in the land between the lakes. He's now, approximately 48 years old. But he's been trapping in there his entire life, and he's been hunting in the land between the lakes. I talked to him about 3 months ago, and I'm in the process of interviewing more people who have had eyewitness accounts of these creatures. He describes a track while he was squirrel hunting in the land between the lakes that he could not identify. Now, keep in mind, this man has been trapping. He knows what animals are there. He's been deer hunting. He's been bear hunting in other areas. But he knows what a track looks like. He describes coming across a track that was a dog track. He said it was the largest dog track he had ever seen in his life. He said there are no dogs around here that can make that track. It had pads and it had claws in the front, very long. He's described this track as being approximately 10 inches. And there are no known dogs that would make a 10-inch track around here. And he was going to go back and get a picture of it, but unfortunately it rained the next day fairly heavily. And when he went back, the track was sort of washed out. It wouldn't have made a good picture. But it's many, many witnesses like this I'm in the process of talking to, and I know you guys are in Germany, but if you happen to hear of any witnesses, I would be very interested in interviewing them. I will give credibility to anybody that talks to me. I'm not doubting anybody's word. That's the problem with a lot of witnesses, is they're afraid of being made fun of or criticized for coming out saying they've seen a track or they've seen a creature. But I would very much like to hear about that. And I am trying to do as much research as I can on this subject.
Mm-hmm. So people, there you heard it. Please contact Steve if you know something. I am in Germany, but that doesn't mean that the show is only in Germany. So the show will be aired everywhere. So yeah, if there's anybody out there that knows something, please contact Steve. And before we wrap it up for today, thank you so much for sharing all these crazy, mind-boggling stories with me. That was very interesting. Is there something else that you want people to know? Maybe where they can find your book, maybe a homepage, or like you said, contact information?
Certainly. My book, the LBL Massacre, is available on Amazon. It's available in Australia, Germany, France. It's available translated in all areas, and it's the LBL Massacre. And I would be glad for anybody who wants to see this story in detail to read it and give me their thoughts on it or their feedback on it. I can be contacted at Steve Causey, that's STEVECAUSEY, at AOL.com. So it's a very easy email address to remember. And I certainly do appreciate you interviewing me today and listening to my story, which I heard many years ago. And I think that everybody who hears the story, it's literally one of those stories that if you hear it for the first time, your mouth drops open.
Indeed. Again, thank you so much for sharing your story. And please stay with me for 2 more minutes, okay?
Yes, sir.